Blackout Nation. Written by Scott Medbury. Narrated by Adam Barr. Episode 1. The Lights Go Out. Chapter 1. End of Shift. Sarah Mitchell's hands were still shaking when she pushed through the doors of the ER break room. The tremors had nothing to do with the 4 cups of coffee she had already consumed during her 12-hour shift. They were aftershocks from losing her last patient, a 16-year-old girl whose heart had simply stopped during cheerleading practice. Her reflection in the break room window caught her eye, shoulder-length brown hair escaping its tight ponytail, dark circles under green eyes that had seen too much death for 30 years of life. She looked away quickly. The hospital scrubs hung loose on her athletic frame. She'd lost weight again, something her therapist would probably want to discuss at their next session. "Some days just suck," Rebecca said, looking up from her phone. Her dark curls were escaping from a messy bun, and her scrubs had visible blood stains from the same code blue. Rebecca had been her rock since Sarah started at Mount Sinai 3 years ago, fresh out of the army and trying to adjust to civilian life. "Yeah." Sarah sank into the chair opposite her best friend and fellow nurse. "I really thought we had her. One minute she was doing backflips. The next..." She trailed off, remembering the girl's father arriving too late, his anguished howls still echoing in her ears. "You did everything right." Rebecca reached across the table and squeezed Sarah's hand. "Sometimes everything right still isn't enough." Sarah nodded, trying to push away memories of other times when everything right hadn't been enough. Back in Afghanistan, with different bodies under her hands, different lives slipping away. The desert heat, the smell of blood mixed with dust, the sound of incoming mortars. She took a deep breath and focused on her surroundings, the hum of the fluorescent lights, the faint antiseptic smell, the drone of CNN from the wall-mounted TV. "I need to call Devin," she said, pulling out her phone, "and make sure he got home from school okay. Mrs. Henderson next door watches him, but I like to check in." "How's he doing? Still having trouble adjusting?" "Better. The nightmares about his mom aren't as frequent." Sarah frowned when the phone glitched as she accessed her contacts. Her 8-year-old nephew had been in her care for nearly a year now, ever since her sister had died. "Losing your only parent is a lot for a kid to handle." "You're doing great with him," Rebecca said. "He's lucky to have you." "Damn it." The screen of her phone had gone dark and was now unresponsive. "What's up?" Rebecca asked, taking a bite of a granola bar she'd pulled from her pocket. Sarah tapped her phone's screen, but it remained dark and lifeless. She pressed the power button repeatedly, but there was no response. "Damn battery is flat. But I swear I had 60% left." Rebecca pulled her own phone from her jacket. "Here, why don't you use mine?" She pressed the power button. Her expression shifted. "What the hell?" She jabbed at it again, but the screen stayed dark. "Mine's dead too. I charged it this morning." The break room door burst open. Jason from radiology stuck his head in, his face pale. "Hey, we've got issues. CT just went down mid-scan. Everything's dead." "Everything?" Rebecca asked, standing up. "Everything electrical. Computers, machines, even the backup generators won't start. We've got patients stuck in elevators, monitors offline." The fluorescent lights flickered once and died. For a moment, they stood in the gray afternoon light filtering through the windows. Then the backup lights should have kicked in. They didn't. "What the hell?" Sarah muttered, her combat-trained instincts starting to tingle. Something wasn't right. This was more than a simple power outage. A car alarm started wailing in the parking lot, then another, and another. Through the window, Sarah watched as traffic signals went dark. Cars began piling up at the intersection, their angry horns adding to the cacophony. A city bus drifted powerless through the intersection, causing other vehicles to swerve wildly. In the distance, she heard the distinctive sound of metal crushing metal, followed by more horns and the first human screams. "This isn't just us," Sarah said, as adrenaline flooded her system. "This is everything." She turned to Rebecca and Jason, who were still staring out the window as more crashes echoed through the city. "We need to get to our patients. Now. Jason, find Dr. Patel. Rebecca, we'll start with the ICU." As they rushed from the break room, Sarah's mind was already racing through the implications. No power meant no ventilators, no monitors, no medicine pumps. Their most critical patients had minutes, maybe less. The thought that this might be an electromagnetic pulse, something she'd learned about during her Army days, tried to surface, but she pushed it away. Right now, she needed to focus on the immediate crisis. Still, the soldier in her, the part that had survived 3 tours in Afghanistan, was screaming that this was just the beginning. She couldn't know it then, but this was the last normal moment of her life. The last moment when the world made sense. The last moment before everything changed. Behind her, the TV screen was black. Chapter 2. Code Black. Different emotions crossed Jake Cooper's face as he stood at his living room window, watching the chaos on his street begin to unfold. A minivan rolled to a slow stop, its confused driver stepping out to inspect the lifeless engine. Neighbors emerged from their homes, shouting questions into the thickening air of unease, while others fumbled with dead cell phones. Jake's stomach tightened as he imagined the same confusion rippling through busier parts of the city. Crammed highways turning into parking lots, desperate crowds piling into unlit stores. This was just the beginning. People would be panicking soon. But Jake had been preparing for this moment for the past decade. His friends and family outside of the prepper community had called him paranoid, obsessed even, but he knew this day would come. The digital clock on his microwave had gone dark, along with every other electronic device in his modest suburban home. His first thought was blackout, but the simultaneous failure of every vehicle driving on his street, the dead phones, the way even battery-operated devices had fried. This was textbook EMP. Jake hurried to his basement, where his Faraday cage protected his essential electronics, a few radios, an old laptop, some key components. His hands shook slightly as he powered up the ham radio. Static burst through the speakers, then voices. "Multiple strikes across the eastern seaboard. Nothing working west of Chicago. Unconfirmed reports of a mushroom cloud over D.C. Military communications completely dark." He switched frequencies, hunting for official broadcasts, emergency channels, anything. But there was only chaos and speculation. One voice cut through clearer than the others, someone he recognized from the prepper networks. "This is Delta 6 in Montana. We're tracking multiple detonations. High-altitude bursts consistent with EMP weapons. No ground strikes confirmed except... Wait, getting reports from the Capitol. Jesus Christ." The transmission cut off. Jake tried other frequencies but found only static or panicked chatter about simultaneous attacks across the country. Yet the reports were accurate. This wasn't just one strike. This was a coordinated takedown of the entire national infrastructure. He switched off the radio, his earlier excitement cooling into something harder, more focused. This was worse than even he had anticipated. His garage contained enough food and water to last 6 months, maybe more if he was careful. The gun safe in his bedroom held an impressive arsenal, all legally acquired. Everything he needed was ready. Movement across the road caught his eye. Mrs. Henderson was on her front porch with Devon, his next-door neighbor Sarah's 8-year-old nephew. The old lady looked confused as she repeatedly pressed her car's key fob. Jake guessed she was planning to take the boy to his aunt's workplace. The kid was clutching his backpack and starting to look scared. From observation, Jake knew Mrs. Henderson picked up the boy on Mondays, Tuesdays, and Wednesdays, normally watching him cross the road and waiting until he was safely inside Sarah's house. Jake's excitement dimmed further. He'd seen Sarah leave for her hospital shift that morning, noting how tired she looked. He'd noticed a lot about his neighbor in the 9 months since she'd taken in her nephew, though they'd rarely spoken beyond casual hellos and occasional conversation. He knew she was a nurse, that she'd served in the military, and that she worked too damn hard. Now, looking at the boy's frightened face, Jake realized his long-awaited apocalypse would have casualties. Real people, not just theoretical scenarios. Good people, like the pretty nurse next door who had no idea what was coming. A series of crashes echoed from downtown, followed by distant screams. Mrs. Henderson hugged the boy closer, her head turning toward the sounds. Jake grabbed his bug-out bag from beside the door. He'd have to help them, at least until Sarah could get home. If she could get home. The hospital would be chaos right now, and the streets weren't going to be safe for long. "Time to be a good neighbor," he muttered, checking the concealed pistol at his hip before heading for the door. The real test of survival wasn't just about having the right supplies. It was about building a community you could trust. Still, as he stepped onto his porch, he couldn't quite suppress his excitement. If the chatter was right, and they were under attack, the old world was as good as dead, its technology useless. Now his skills would finally matter. Now, everyone would understand what he'd been preparing for. The real question was, how many of them would survive long enough to learn? Sarah burst through the ICU doors with Rebecca on her heels. The quiet efficiency of the unit had devolved into barely controlled chaos. Monitors that normally beeped reassuringly were black and silent. The ventilator alarms that should have been screaming weren't, and nurses were clustered around beds, doing manual bag ventilation on critical patients. The sharp scent of fear had joined the usual hospital smells of antiseptic and sickness. "How many vents?" Sarah called out, falling into the calm, clipped tone she'd used in combat hospitals. The one that told everyone around her that someone was in control, even if everything was falling apart. 7 patients, Karen, the charge nurse, answered, her usual perfect makeup now streaked with sweat. "We've got people bagging 5 of them. Still need hands on bed 3 and 6. 3 of them are COVID patients. Everyone on those beds needs full PPE. "I've got 3, Rebecca said, already moving to grab a mask and gown. Some habits were so ingrained they didn't need power to maintain. 6 is mine. Sarah grabbed an ambu bag from the crash cart, quickly donning her own protective gear. Her patient was an elderly man, unconscious and unaware of how critical the next few minutes would be. She checked his tube placement, attached the bag, and started the steady rhythm. Squeeze, release, squeeze, release. Her mind flashed to similar moments in Afghanistan, keeping soldiers alive when generators failed during dust storms. Her muscles remembered, even if she wished they didn't. A young nurse, Emily, Sarah thought, still new enough that her scrubs looked fresh, was struggling with her technique on the next bed. Sarah caught her eye. "Match my rhythm," she said firmly. "Like this. Count it out if you need to. These are their lungs now. We have to be perfect." Emily nodded gratefully and fell into sync with Sarah's pace. Around them, other nurses were doing the same. the room filling with the soft sound of whispered counting and the mechanical whoosh of manual ventilation. Dr. Patel appeared beside her, looking more disheveled than she'd ever seen the usually immaculate physician. His tie was loose, and dark sweat stains showed under his arms. "No power anywhere. Generators are fried. I've got runners heading to the other floors for supplies. Everything electric is down, including the pneumatic tube system and elevators." "What about evac?" Sarah asked between breaths. Squeeze, release. Squeeze, release. Her arms were already starting to burn. "To where? I'm hearing reports that it's the whole city. No working vehicles, no phones, nothing electric." He lowered his voice, leaning in close enough that she could smell his aftershave mixed with stress sweat. "Sarah, I know you have military experience. Ever seen anything like this?" She had. During training, they'd discussed scenarios exactly like this. But saying it out loud would make it real, would make the implications impossible to ignore. "Could be an EMP," she finally admitted. "Electromagnetic pulse. Takes out everything electronic unless it's shielded. Usually a high-altitude nuclear detonation." "Jesus," he muttered, his dark skin going ashen. "How long?" He was cut off by shouting from the hallway. A man in a blood-stained business suit appeared in the doorway, wild-eyed and aggressive. His tie was gone, and his white shirt was spattered with red. "My wife needs help. There was a crash. She's bleeding. Somebody help her, now." "Sir," Dr. Patel started, moving toward him. "Let me—" "Now!" The man reached into his jacket. Sarah saw the glint of metal and reacted instantly. "Gun!" she shouted, muscle memory taking over as she dropped to one knee, keeping her body between the weapon and her patient. Her hands never stopped their rhythm on the ambu bag, even as her mind shifted into combat mode, calculating angles, exits, threats. But the man wasn't attacking. He pulled out a Rolex and thrust it toward Dr. Patel, his hands shaking. "It's worth $30,000. Please, please help her. She's pregnant." The last word hung in the air like a physical thing. Sarah saw Emily falter in her rhythm for just a moment before recovering. Security arrived, looking very insecure without their radios, and escorted the man out, promising his wife would be seen in the ER. Sarah stood slowly, her heart pounding. She'd never gotten used to that surge of adrenaline, not in Afghanistan and not here, the way it made everything sharper, clearer, while simultaneously making her feel sick to her stomach. "Sarah?" Rebecca's voice was tight. She'd moved closer during the confrontation, protecting her own patient. Her face was glistening with sweat above her mask. "You need to go." "What? I can't, Devin," Rebecca said firmly. "If this is what you think it is, you need to get to him. Now, before things get worse." Sarah looked down at her patient, then at the chaos around her. More shouts were coming from the hallway. Smoke was visible through the windows now, rising from multiple points in the city. Her training told her to stay, to help, to do her duty. The soldier in her rebelled at the thought of leaving her post. But Devin was out there, alone, except for Mrs. Henderson. And if this really was an EMP... She thought of his face this morning, sleepy and innocent as she'd dropped them off at school. He'd been clutching the stuffed tiger that was his latest security blanket, the one thing that seemed to help with the nightmares. What would happen when night came and there were no lights to keep the darkness at bay? Rebecca grabbed the arm of a nearby student nurse, her voice sharp and authoritative. "Kim, take over for Sarah here. Monitor the patient's vitals and keep bagging him until the vents come back online, or until someone tells you otherwise." "Go," Rebecca said again, reading the conflict on Sarah's face. "I've got this patient. Go get your boy." She paused, then added quietly, "And Sarah, be careful. People are already starting to panic." Sarah squeezed her friend's arm, handed over the ambubag with its life-giving rhythm, and ran. Behind her, she heard more shouts, more demands for help, more signs of a world rapidly spiraling out of control. Through the windows, she could see more smoke rising over the city. Somewhere in the distance, a car horn was blaring, stuck in an endless scream. She just prayed she wasn't already too late. As she hit the stairwell, taking the steps two at a time, Sarah tried not to think about what was waiting outside. If this really was an EMP, everything she'd trained for told her the window of opportunity to get home safely was closing fast. Once people realized this wasn't a temporary outage, once they understood what they'd lost. She pushed through the stairwell door into the lobby, where a crowd of scared and angry people were already gathering. Many were bleeding from car accidents. Others just looked lost, holding dead phones and useless car keys. Sarah squared her shoulders and moved through them purposefully. She had 4 miles to cover on foot, through a city that was quickly learning it had lost everything that made it function. Time to move. Chapter 3. Opportunity Knocks. 10 blocks away from where Jake was stepping through his front door to help his neighbors, someone else watched. Marcus Williams leaned against the railing on the roof of the 6-story apartment building he lived in, his dark eyes scanning the chaos below with cold amusement. From here he could see the city unraveling, cars dead in intersections, their drivers arguing and flailing helplessly. A crowd had formed outside the convenience store 2 blocks down, the tension mounting as shouts turned into shoves. He'd heard the sharp crack of a gunshot not 10 minutes ago, and knew it wouldn't be the last. His smile was faint, but sharp, a predator's grin. Unlike the sheep below, Marcus didn't panic. His day job was running a protection racket on the east side, extorting businesses for protection money. And chaos like this wasn't a crisis. It was an opportunity, a big one. With a small army of loyal thugs at his command, if he played his cards right, he could seize control of the whole city, just like he had in the joint. Chaos was beautiful. He took a long drag from his cigarette, savoring the moment. 10 years in a federal prison had taught him patience, had given him time to plan, if not exactly for a moment like this, certainly for the opportunity it presented. The gang he'd been building and running since his release 2 years ago was battle-ready. They had weapons, supplies, and most importantly, a command structure. While everyone else panicked, his people would be organized. His radio crackled, one of the few electronic devices that still worked, thanks to the Faraday cage he'd built after reading about EMPs in prison. "Boss, you seeing this?" It was Jensen, his second-in-command. "I'm seeing it." Marcus crushed out his cigarette under his boot. At 45, he kept himself as hard and lean as he'd been in prison. The plain black T-shirt he wore showed arms corded with muscle and prison tattoos. "Get the men moving. You know the targets." "Police station first?" "No. Medical supplies are priority 1. Hit Mount Sinai Hospital. Their backup generators will be fried, and they'll be overwhelmed. Easy pickings." "What about the staff?" Marcus watched as a woman below tried to calm her crying children. Weak. The weak always died first when systems failed. "Anyone who cooperates lives. Anyone who resists..." He let the sentence hang. "Understood, boss. What about the cop's daughter?" A smile stretched across Marcus's face as he thought of the teenage girl his men had grabbed yesterday. The police chief's daughter had been insurance against the raid they'd been expecting. Now she was leverage of a different sort, and would ease his takeover of the police station when the time came. The chief would be far more amenable to surrender when he saw that cooperation could buy his daughter's freedom. "Keep her alive, for now." He paused, watching smoke begin to rise from several points in the city. "Her daddy's going to help us take control of what's left of this city, whether he wants to or not." "Copy that. Jensen out." Marcus pulled a 9mm Glock from his waistband and checked the magazine, more from habit than necessity. 10 years inside had taught him another lesson. Power vacuums didn't last long. Either you stepped in to fill them, or someone else did. Below, he heard glass breaking. The looting was starting earlier than he'd expected. That was fine. Let them fight over TVs that would never work again, and cash that would soon be worthless. His targets were more strategic: medical supplies, fuel, food distribution centers, the pieces that would let him control what was left. A scream echoed up from the street. Marcus looked down to see 3 men attacking the woman with the children, trying to take her car. Useless. The car would never start again. But people were slow to understand how much they'd lost. He watched dispassionately as the scene played out. The woman fought back harder than he'd expected, managing to bloody one attacker's nose before they knocked her down. Her children's screams grew louder. Marcus raised his Glock, sighted carefully, and put a round through the head of the man beating the woman. Before his body hit the ground, Marcus had dropped the other 2 attackers. The shots echoed off the buildings, clean and precise. The woman grabbed her children and ran. She hadn't even looked up to see where her salvation had come from. That was fine. She wasn't important. But the 3 men he'd killed had forced his hand. As far as he was concerned, his reign had begun, and he couldn't allow random violence in his territory. Violence needed to be controlled, measured, purposeful, like in prison. Marcus ejected his magazine and replaced the spent rounds. By sunset, he would control 12 blocks. By tomorrow, half the city. After that, his radio crackled again. "Boss, we're in position at the hospital." "Execute," he said simply, already turning toward the stairwell. He had his own objectives to handle. In the street below, blood spread around the 3 corpses. No one approached them. No one tried to help. The first lesson of the new world was being learned. Stay out of the way. Keep your head down. Don't draw attention. Marcus smiled. This new world would be fun. Sarah slipped out of Mount Sinai's side entrance, avoiding the growing crowd at the emergency room doors. Her shoes, comfortable nursing clogs that had seen 1,000 shifts, made no sound on the pavement as she moved. The evening air felt charged, different, like the atmosphere before a thunderstorm. The hair on the back of her neck stood up as she noticed a group of men approaching the hospital's main entrance. Something about their purposeful stride and coordinated movements set off warning bells. These weren't worried relatives or injured civilians. This was a team. Her soldier's instincts kicked in, and she pressed herself against the wall so that she was partially hidden behind a row of dead ambulances. The men moved like wolves among sheep, weaving through the crowd of panicked civilians with practiced ease. 6 of them total, all wearing casual clothes that didn't quite mask their disciplined and menacing demeanors. Their leader was tall, muscular, with a distinctive neck tattoo visible above his collar. The others flanked him in a loose formation that spoke of tactical knowledge. Sarah studied their gear through narrowed eyes. They wore lightweight jackets despite the warm evening. Concealment, not comfort. She caught glimpses of weapon bulges, saw the slight adjustments they made as they walked to accommodate the hidden hardware. 2 carried backpacks that likely held more than just supplies. These men hadn't just grabbed whatever weapons they could find. They were equipped, prepared. The leader spoke into a radio, a detail that made her blood run cold. Nothing electronic was working, yet they had functioning communications. They'd known this was coming. The man gestured, splitting his team into 2 groups of 3, each taking different entrances. Classic penetration strategy. "Hospital security is on high alert already," she whispered to herself, trying to find comfort in the thought. "They've got good people, trained people. They'll be ready for this." But even as she said it, she knew hospital security wasn't prepared for men like these. Not today. Not when everything had changed. Every instinct screamed at her to go back, to warn Rebecca and the others. The soldier in her mapped out how she could do it, slip back inside, sound the alarm, help organize a defense. She knew the hospital's layout better than they did. But Devon's face flashed in her mind, and the mental map reoriented to the 4 miles between her and her nephew. The city was already unraveling. She could smell smoke, hear sporadic gunshots, see the first signs of looting in broken windows down the block. One of the men paused at the entrance, scanning the area. Sarah held her breath as his gaze passed over her hiding spot. A pistol grip was visible under his jacket as he turned. Not just any gun. She recognized the distinctive shape of a suppressor. These men weren't planning to announce their presence. "I'm sorry," she whispered, thinking of Rebecca and her patients, of Dr. Patel and Emily and all the others. The soldier in her called it cowardice. The aunt in her called it survival. The familiar weight of guilt settled on her shoulders. She had felt it before, in Afghanistan, when hard choices meant living with consequences. She moved away from the hospital, keeping to the shadows, using parked cars as cover. Her movements were automatic, muscle memory from years of training. Stay low, maintain awareness, avoid open spaces. Behind her, she heard the first shouts begin inside the building, then a sound that might have been a muffled gunshot. Her pace quickened, but every step away from the hospital felt like failure. The streets were a maze of obstacles, stalled cars, confused people, the first signs of violence. She cut through alleys when possible, changing her route whenever something felt wrong. The 4-mile journey home had never felt longer. On Jefferson Street, she passed a convenience store being looted. The owner stood helplessly by as teenagers emptied his shelves. Their laughter echoed off brick walls, still innocent, like this was some kind of snow day adventure. They didn't understand yet. The owner caught her eye, and she saw that he did. Sarah kept moving. 2 blocks later, she heard a scream from an alley and saw a woman being dragged into a doorway by 2 men. This time, she couldn't just move on. She took 3 steps into the alley, her fight response triggered, but froze when a shotgun blast sent one of the woman's assailants crashing into the brick wall. A black man with salt and pepper hair emerged from the doorway opposite the woman and her remaining attacker, racking the shotgun. The surviving thug bolted like the devil himself was after him, and the old man rushed to help the woman. Sarah nodded when he looked up and met her eyes. She ran on. Her scrubs marked her as medical personnel, drawing desperate looks from injured people. A man with a bleeding head wound reached for her. "Please," she shouldered past him, hating herself but knowing she couldn't stop. Not now. The residential streets were quieter, but somehow worse. Neighbors stood in small clusters, sharing theories. Kids played in yards while their parents tried calling dead phones. They were still waiting for the authorities to fix this. Still believed help was coming. "Hey, nurse!" Sarah turned. A man in a dirty hoodie was approaching fast from behind, reaching for her backpack. No weapon visible, but his eyes were wild, desperate. Without breaking stride, she dropped her center of gravity, just like combat training, and drove her elbow backward into his solar plexus. As he doubled over, she brought her knee up into his face. The moves were fluid, automatic, muscle memory from endless drills. He sprawled onto the pavement, blood spurting from his nose. "Crazy bitch!" he gasped. "Stay down," she warned, her voice cold. Inside, she was shaking, but her hands were steady. She'd learned that in Afghanistan, too, how to function through fear. A woman watching from her porch quickly went inside and locked her door. Smart. Sarah picked up her pace. The sun was getting lower, shadows lengthening. Even though the crowds had thinned to almost nothing the further into the suburbs she got, most people having headed to the safety of their homes, she didn't want to be out after dark. Not today. Finally, her street, her house. But something was wrong. Opposite, Mrs. Henderson's car was in her driveway. Door open. The front door of the old lady's house stood ajar. She sprinted the last 50 yards to her front door, unlocking it and flinging it open. "Devon!" The house was empty. No Devon. No Mrs. Henderson. No signs of struggle. But no note either. Wherever they were, Devon hadn't made it through their front door. Fear clawed at her throat. "Devon!" She ran back outside, scanning the street. Nothing moved, except curtains quickly closing as neighbors avoided her gaze. "Devon!" Chapter 4. Rushed Choices. "Aunt Sarah!" Devon's voice cut through her panic like a blade. Sarah spun toward her next-door neighbor's house and saw her nephew leaning out of an upstairs window, his dark hair tousled, eyes wide with excitement rather than fear. Relief hit her so hard her knees almost buckled. "Devon, stay there, I'm coming." She was halfway to Jake's front door when it opened. He stood in the doorway, his light, muscular frame somehow more imposing than she remembered from their casual neighborly encounters. Gone was the laid-back survival instructor who taught weekend courses in the state park. This man moved with the contained energy of someone who'd spent years preparing for this exact moment. He held up his hands in a peaceful gesture, but she noticed how he positioned himself, ready for anything. "He's safe," Jake said quickly. "Mrs. Henderson, too. I got them inside when everything went dark. I've been watching the situation develop." Sarah took in the details. The gun holstered at his hip, the tactical vest, the radio clipped to his belt, another functioning radio, like the men at the hospital had. Her combat instincts flared. "Move," she said, her voice hard. "I'm taking my nephew." "Aunt Sarah!" Devon burst past Jake and ran to her. She caught him in a fierce hug, checking him over for any injuries even as she tried to keep one eye on Jake. The stuffed tiger was clutched in Devon's hand, its fur slightly singed. "Mr. Cooper made us hot chocolate on a real fire, and he showed me his solar panels and his radio room and—" "Radio room?" Sarah interrupted, looking up at Jake with renewed suspicion. "Oh, don't worry about all that prepper nonsense," Mrs. Henderson called from inside, appearing behind Jake. The elderly woman looked oddly cheerful, as if this were just another power outage. "Though I must say it was nice having somewhere to wait for you, Sarah dear. But now that you're here, I should head home. My cats will be wondering where their dinner is." Jake turned to her, his expression grave. "Mrs. Henderson, please. It's not safe. This isn't a normal blackout. The power isn't coming back on tonight. Maybe not for a long time." "Nonsense," she said, gathering her purse and cardigan. "The authorities will have it sorted by morning. I've lived through plenty of outages before. Besides, I have candles, and my landline phone should still work." She patted Jake's arm. "You're a sweet boy to worry, but I'll be fine. It's just across the street, after all." "Martha," Jake's voice took on an urgent tone, "your landline won't work. Nothing electrical will work. This is different. Please, stay. But Mrs. Henderson was already moving past them, that same cheerful determination on her face.
I'll leave my porch light on. Well, I would if it worked.
She laughed at her own joke.
You'll be able to see I'm fine from here. Thank you for the hospitality. Please, lock your door right away, he called after her, and call if you need anything.
Sarah caught the flash of frustration on Jake's face as he watched the older woman walk away. She understood it. She'd seen that same stubborn denial in patients' families, refusing to accept bad news. But she had more immediate concerns. Maybe we should talk inside, Jake said, gesturing at the growing shadows. The street won't be safe now that it's getting dark.
Please, Aunt Sarah?
Devon tugged at her scrubs.
Mr. Cooper has a whole room of emergency supplies and games, and he says we can stay until—
Devon, Jake interrupted gently. Let's let your aunt make her own decisions. He turned back to Sarah. But he's right about the supplies and the security. Whatever's happening, it's not going to get better tonight. You're welcome to stay. Both of you. No obligations. A scream echoed from somewhere in the distance, followed by the sound of breaking glass. Sarah pulled Devon closer, watching as Mrs. Henderson waved reassuringly at them from her front porch, apparently unperturbed by the scream, before stepping inside and shutting her door.
Why?
She asked Jake, turning back to him.
Why help us?
His expression softened slightly.
Because that's what neighbors do. And because I've been preparing for something like this for years. Having good people nearby. That matters now. More than ever.
Sarah studied him for a long moment. Everything she'd learned in the military and in life told her to be cautious. But she'd also learned to read people, and what she saw in Jake's steady gaze wasn't threatening. It was competent, prepared. There was something else, too, something in the way he looked at her that made her pulse quicken in a way that had nothing to do with fear.
Okay, she said finally. We'll stay. For now.
Jake nodded and stepped aside to let them enter. As Sarah crossed the threshold, she caught a glimpse of his living room, completely transformed into what looked like a command center, with maps spread across tables and carefully organized supplies along the walls. A small fire burned in the hearth, casting dancing shadows on stacks of emergency gear. Whatever was happening, Jake Cooper had been ready for it. The question was, could she trust him? From across the street came the faint glow of candlelight in Mrs. Henderson's window. Sarah caught Jake watching it too, his jaw tight with worry. Finally, he shut the front door with a thud, revealing its inner lining of metal sheets and heavy-duty hinges. He slid 3 thick deadbolts into place, locking out the encroaching darkness, or locking them in. She kept a firm grip on Devon's shoulder, hoping her instincts about Jake were right, but prepared to fight if they weren't. Either way, it would be a long night. Sarah sat at Jake's kitchen table, warming her hands around a mug of real coffee, a luxury she hadn't expected to find on a day like this. The wood stove crackled softly, fighting back the growing chill of the October night. Devon was asleep upstairs, exhausted from the excitement and fear, his stuffed tiger clutched tight against his chest. She'd checked on him twice already, each time finding him in the same position, face peaceful, despite everything that had happened. The kitchen counter behind Jake was lined with emergency gear, radios, maps, weapons, and first aid supplies, all meticulously organized. A lantern cast warm light across the room, making it feel normal, almost. But the occasional distant gunshot or scream reminded them that nothing was normal anymore.
"You're not what I expected," Sarah said,
studying Jake over the rim of her mug. He'd changed into cargo pants and a black t-shirt that showed a physique built from years of outdoor training. When I moved in, I thought you were just the crazy prepper next door. Jake's mouth quirked into a half smile. Teaching weekend warriors how to start fires. Something like that? She found herself returning his smile, then quickly looked away. Though I have to admit, those survival classes make more sense now. I knew you were ex-military before you even told me. I've trained with enough veterans to spot it, Jake said, leaning back in his chair. Just little things. Like how your eyes sweep the area when we're chatting over the fence, or the way you always position yourself with something solid behind you. Even the way you scan rooms when you enter them. Sarah tensed slightly. I see. And what unit was I with, in your expert opinion? Combat medic, he said, watching her reaction carefully. Well, I guess given that you know I'm an ER nurse, that wasn't too hard to work out. Where did you serve? Sarah studied him for a long moment before answering. 3 tours. Afghanistan. Rough posting. Jake's voice was quieter now. I've had students from over there. Never talked much about it, but it taught me a lot. Made me realize all my book learning and practice scenarios were just that. Practice. Sarah took a sip of coffee, pushing back memories of dust and blood and impossible choices. So when did you know this was something bigger than a blackout? Jake spread a map across the table, pinning down the corners with empty coffee mugs. I've been researching grid vulnerabilities for years, writing articles for survival blogs, teaching courses on it. Most people thought I was paranoid. He traced a line across the city infrastructure. I always thought EMP was the most likely scenario for a collapse, and the signs today were textbook. Simultaneous vehicle failures, electronics dying even with backup power, classic electromagnetic pulse. The hospital, Sarah said. Everything died at once. Then those men showed up, armed, organized. Sarah told him about the group she'd seen at the hospital, their coordinated movements, their working communications equipment, and weapons. Jake nodded grimly. That happened quickly. Some hobbyists, and definitely anyone serious about survival, keep essential electronics in Faraday cages. Coupled with weapons, though. It sounds like those guys were prepared or ready enough to take advantage when it happened. Sarah leaned forward. What happens next in your EMP scenarios? Infrastructure will fall like dominoes, he said, tapping specific points on the map. Power goes first, then water treatment, food distribution, medical services. I've run scenario drills with my students, how fast things fall apart, how people react. But this, he shook his head, this is going to be worse than any simulation. Another scream echoed from somewhere in the darkness outside. They both tensed, but it wasn't close. The hospital, Sarah said quietly. I keep thinking about the people I left behind. I'm not sure security was equipped to deal with those men. Her fingers tightened around the coffee mug. Jake reached across the table and touched her hand. She blushed at the unexpected gesture. You did the right thing, he said. Devon needed you. And from what I've seen of you today, you don't abandon people easily. Sometimes survival means making hard choices. Sarah pulled her hands away, unsettled by her reaction to his touch, and took a sip of her coffee to mask any awkwardness. This wasn't the time for whatever that was. Sarah got up and went to the darkened front window, peeking into the street. A flicker of movement caught her eye, candlelight dancing in Mrs. Henderson's front window. Jake went to the other side of the window and pulled the heavy blackout curtain aside. He followed her gaze. "She shouldn't be alone over there," he said. "I tried to tell her." Sarah nodded and let the curtain fall back into place as she walked back to the table. Jake followed. "Some people can't accept how much the world can change in a day," Sarah said, "or don't want to accept it." She thought of the hospital administrator she passed on the way out of the hospital, who was insisting help was coming even as chaos spread. "It's easier to believe things will go back to normal." "Normal's gone," Jake said, as he began to pour them a refill. "The only question now is how we—" The sound of breaking glass cut through the night. Mrs. Henderson's scream followed immediately after. They were both on their feet instantly. Jake grabbed a rifle from the counter while Sarah checked her borrowed pistol, a Glock he'd given her after dinner, along with a quick refresher on the weapon's operation. "Devin?" she whispered urgently. "Second floor, reinforced door. He's safer there than with us." Jake was already moving toward his front door, his movements silent and practiced. "Your call. We can help her, or we can stay here and protect what's ours." Sarah thought of the hospital, of walking away. Her hand unconsciously touched the combat medic insignia she still wore on a chain around her neck. Never again. "We help," she said, racking the slide on her pistol. "But quiet and fast, no heroes." Jake nodded, locking the front door, a glimmer of approval in his eyes. "On your six." They slipped out into the darkness, moving as one, while Mrs. Henderson's screams grew louder. Behind them, Jake's house stood dark and secure, hiding their sleeping cargo. Chapter 5. Flames. Sarah moved fast but careful, keeping to the shadows. Jake followed, his rifle at low ready. The screaming had stopped. Sarah wasn't sure if that was good or bad. A man's laugh echoed from inside Mrs. Henderson's house, followed by the sound of breaking glass. "Check upstairs, Tommy. Rich bitch like this probably has jewelry." "Don't look that rich to me, Dale." The response came from somewhere above. Across the street, Sarah caught Jake's eye. He held up 2 fingers, then pointed to the side of the house and himself, before the front of the house and her. She nodded, understanding. 2 intruders. She'd take the front, he'd circle around. They darted across the road and parted. The front door hung open, spilling warm candlelight onto the porch. Sarah could see Mrs. Henderson's cat, Magic, dead on the welcome mat, its neck at an unnatural angle. Her grip tightened on the Glock. "Please," Mrs. Henderson's voice drifted out, weak and trembling. "Just take whatever you want. Just don't—" The sound of a slap cut her off. Sarah slipped onto the porch, years of training taking over. The wooden boards didn't creak under her careful tread. Instead, she could see the flicker of multiple candles. Mrs. Henderson had lit them everywhere, creating perfect visibility for her attackers. "Shut up, old woman. Where's your husband?" He passed last year." "Too bad. No one to protect you now." Sarah reached the doorway. Mrs. Henderson was on her knees in the living room, blood trickling from her lip. An overweight man, squeezed into an undersized leather jacket, maybe 40, stood over her. A revolver hung loose in his right hand. "Police will be here soon, Dale Collins," Mrs. Henderson said, still clinging to her normal world. "The phones—" She knew him? Dale laughed. "Phones are dead, you stupid bitch. Everything's dead. No one's coming to help you. No one's coming to help anyone ever again." Sarah took another step inside. One clean shot. But where was the brother? A floorboard creaked behind her. Sarah dove forward as something whooshed through the air where her head had been. She rolled and came up firing. Tommy Collins, Dale's whippet thin brother, yelped as her first round took him in the shoulder, his baseball bat clattering to the floor. "Gun!" he screamed, stumbling backward. Sarah was already moving, but not fast enough. Dale's revolver barked, the sound deafening in the enclosed space. Something hot traced a line across her bicep. She dove behind a couch as two more shots punched into the fabric above her. "Kill the bitch!" Dale was shouting. From the back of the house came the sound of breaking glass and a single rifle shot. Jake. "Shit!" Tommy yelled. "There's more of them!" Sarah popped up, squeezing off 2 rounds that sent Dale scrambling for cover behind a sofa. Mrs. Henderson screamed and curled into a ball. "Let's go!" Dale called to his brother, springing up and running for the door. "Now!" Sarah started to rise, ready to pursue him, but movement caught her eye. Tommy hadn't run at all. Instead, he dashed to Mrs. Henderson, pulling her up by the hair and holding her in front of him like a shield, pressing a knife to her throat and slowly dragging her towards the door. "Stay back!" Tommy was younger than Dale, maybe 30, but his eyes were just as cold. "Drop the gun or I cut her!" Sarah's hands tightened on the Glock. The shot was too risky. Mrs. Henderson was covering most of his vital areas. "Please," Mrs. Henderson whimpered. "Last chance," Tommy said, reaching the door. "Drop it." From somewhere behind Tommy came the sound of Jake's voice, cold and professional. "Drop the knife, or I drop you." Tommy turned the old lady towards the kitchen door, where Jake stood, looking down the barrel of his rifle. The thug pressed the knife harder against Mrs. Henderson's throat and opened his mouth to say something. The clap of the gunshot was deafening in the enclosed space. Tommy's eyes were wide, the back of his skull missing. Mrs. Henderson screamed as his body spilled heavily out of the front door, taking her with it. "Clear," Jake called. "Clear front," Sarah responded automatically. She rushed to Mrs. Henderson, sprawled on the porch and trying weakly to push Tommy's corpse off her legs. "Are you hurt? Martha, look at me. Are you hurt?" Mrs. Henderson's eyes were wide, not fixed on anything. "Dale got away," Jake said from behind her. "Headed east, toward downtown." Sarah nodded absently, her fingers finding Mrs. Henderson's pulse. It was rapid, but strong. She was alive, but in shock. The sound of breaking glass made her spin, a weapon raised. A house across the street, and 3 doors down from hers, was on fire. "There's another one at the end of the street. Don't know if it was these 2 idiots or not, but we need to move," Jake said. "Those fires are going to draw attention, and Dale will be back, with friends." Sarah looked down at Mrs. Henderson, then at Tommy's body, then at the burning house across the way. The street she'd lived on for over a year was transforming into something alien and hostile. "Help me with her," she said. "We'll take her back to your place." Jake nodded and moved to help, but Mrs. Henderson suddenly pulled away from them both, shoving Sarah in the chest. "No," she said. "No, I need to clean this up. The police will want everything just as it is, for evidence." "Martha," Sarah said gently, "the police aren't—" "Just go!" The older woman's voice was shrill, hysterical. I need to clean up. Just go!" Sarah started to argue, but Jake touched her arm. "We can't force her. If we do, we're no better than Tommy and Dale. And we need to get back to Devon." Sarah looked at the blood on Mrs. Henderson's face, at the dead man on her floor, at the candles still burning cheerfully inside the home. Normal was gone, but not everyone could accept that. "We'll come back," she promised, but Mrs. Henderson was already turning away, muttering about cleaning supplies. They backed out of the house together, covering each other. The fires were spreading to a 3rd house now. In the distance, more flames lit up the city skyline, like a malevolent sunset. Devin was waiting at the top of the stairs when they returned, his stuffed tiger clutched tight against his chest. Sarah's heart clenched at the fear in his eyes.
"I heard gunshots," he whispered. "Come here, buddy."
Sarah held out her arms, and he flew down the stairs into them. She caught Jake's eye over Devin's head. He nodded and moved to secure the house, checking locks and sightlines.
"Were you fighting bad guys?"
Devin's voice was muffled against her shoulder.
"No, it was just some loud noises. Everything's okay."
The lie tasted bitter, but she forced a smile as she pulled back to look at him.
"But you should be in bed, mister."
"I was scared."
"I know. But you're safe here. Remember what I told you about Mr. Cooper's house being special? Like a fortress?"
Devin nodded, then frowned as he spotted the blood on her sleeve.
"You're hurt."
"Just a scratch. Nothing your aunt can't handle," Jake said, returning from his security check. He kept his voice light, but Sarah saw the tension in his shoulders. "How about I patch her up and then make us some hot chocolate before bed?" Jake's movements were efficient and clinical as he cleaned the graze wound with antiseptic from his first aid kit. Sarah watched him work, noting his field medic skills were decent, not up to her combat medic standards, but he clearly knew what he was doing. The wound wasn't deep, but it would leave another scar. Jake wrapped it with a pressure bandage, his touch professional. "It'll hold," he said simply, packing away the supplies. "Just stay off it for a few days." "Okay, I'll be sure to do that," she said, with a roll of the eyes. While Jake heated water on the wood stove, Sarah got Devin settled on the couch with a blanket. The emergency radio on the kitchen counter crackled with scattered transmissions, mostly confusion, panic, and growing chaos. But one voice cut through clearer than the others. "This is Colonel Harrison, 10th Mountain Division. All units, fall back to Fort Drum. Repeat, fall back to Fort Drum. Civilian infrastructure is compromised. Washington is dark. Chain of command is—" Static consumed the rest. Sarah and Jake exchanged glances. The military was pulling out, abandoning the cities. Whatever was coming, they'd face it alone.
"Story?"
Devin asked hopefully, already half asleep despite the hot chocolate. Sarah started to refuse. It was late, and they all needed rest. But Jake sat down in the armchair across from him, his face softening in the lantern light. "Did I ever tell you about the time I taught a group of Boy Scouts how to build an igloo?" he began. Sarah listened as Jake spun a tale about winter survival, watching Devin's eyes grow heavy. His voice was different when he talked to the boy. Gentler, without the tactical edge he'd heard earlier. By the time he finished, Devin was asleep against her shoulder.
"You're good with him,"
she said quietly as Jake helped her carry Devin upstairs to the guest room. "Kids are resilient. Sometimes they just need to know the adults have a plan." He paused at the top of the stairs. "We should get some rest, too. Tomorrow's going to be a long day." Sarah nodded, suddenly exhausted. The events of the day, the EMP, the hospital, Mrs. Henderson, the firefight, crashed over her like a wave. "Take my room," Jake said. "I'll crash on the couch. Better vantage point of the street, anyway." "I can take the couch, Sarah." His voice was firm but gentle. "You need real rest. That arm needs to heal." She started to argue, but caught herself. He was right. They all needed to be at their best. Whatever was coming, they'd face it tomorrow. "Thank you," she said simply, "for everything." Jake's hand brushed her uninjured arm. So briefly she might have imagined it. "Get some sleep. I've got first watch."
Sarah closed the bedroom door behind her, automatically noting the window sightlines, the escape routes. The bed smelled faintly of gun oil and pine. Like Jake. She pushed that thought away and lay down, fully clothed, her borrowed Glock within easy reach. Outside, the city burned. But in this room, in this fortress Jake had built, she allowed herself to close her eyes. Just for a few hours. Just until dawn. The end of Episode 1. The Lights Go Out. Written by Scott Medbury. Narrated by Adam Barr.
If you're enjoying Scott's audiobook content, please like and subscribe. It's the best way to help out the channel.